Once at a church meeting, a wealthy member of the church rose to tell the rest of those present about his Christian faith. "I'm a millionaire," he said, "and I attribute my wealth to the blessings of God in my life." And he went on to record the turning point in his relationship with God. As a young man, he had just earned his first dollar, and he went to a church meeting that night. And the speaker at that meeting was a missionary who told about his work in the mission field. And before the offering plate was passed around, the preacher told everyone that everything that was collected that night would be given to this missionary to help fund his work on behalf of the church. The wealthy man wanted to give support to the mission work, but he knew that he couldn't make change from the offering plate. He couldn't put his dollar and take 50 cents in change from it. He knew he either had to give all he had or nothing at all. At that moment, he decided to give all that he had to God. And looking back, he said that he knew that God had blessed that decision and made him wealthy. When he finished, there was silence in the room. As he returned to his seat and sat down, an elderly lady seated behind him leant forward in a rather penetrating voice said, "I dare you to do it again." When we start out, it's easy to remember that the gifts and opportunities that come our way are from God. But something happens along the way. We forget the owner. We come to think of the vineyard and everything it produces as something we own. Now, in the lectionary here in the pulpit, the reading from Isaiah is printed to look like a poem because in the original, that is what it is. I know in our missals at home, it's written like a paragraph instead of like a poem. But that's what it is. And in rich imagery, a friend of God speaks on God's behalf to us. But what starts as a love song turns a little discordant at the end. The first part of the reading describes a very careful preparation for the vineyard. And then the vineyard owner asks, "What more could I do?" Having heard of the preparation of the vineyard, we would answer, "Nothing more." And we cannot ignore the initial message of this poem from Isaiah. How God has shown tender love for the people and prepared them well. The words we heard were dug up, planted, cleared, all saying that took great care of this vineyard. And that means that we can ask ourselves now, do we notice God's loving care in our lives? God is not aloof. God is not watching you at a distance, far away. God is nurturing and giving us every opportunity for fruitfulness, for us individuals, but also for our believing community, for the church. I think God sounds just like a parent. God is like a parent spending years giving a child the best family environment, the best education possible. And then the parent learns that the child has got into trouble. What more could I have done to prevent this? The parent says sadly. And the narrator's voice returns at the end of the passage to make sure that there are no doubts about the application of the story. The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. God looked for judgment, but see, bloodshed. For justice, but hark, the outcry. So those are strong words that we hear in the first reading today. In Isaiah's parable, the vineyard itself is a disappointment. It yielded wild grapes. So we can imagine small little grapes, sour, not even worth eating. That's the type of grapes the vineyard yielded. Now, where did these come from, since it was planted with the choicest vines and was lovingly tended? The owner certainly didn't ignore the vineyard. And it seems to be the vineyard's doing. Remember, this is a parable, this is an image, and in stories like this, even a vineyard can be cantankerous and rebellious. And so the prophet says to us, it is the vineyard's fault. Now, an Israelite could not hear a story about a vineyard without knowing that the vineyard was so often used as a metaphor for the house of Israel. The people knew that God had chosen, planted, tended, and promised to watch over them. And since they would know that this was applied to them, Isaiah invites the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the people of Judah to respond to God's lament. God says, "What more was there to do for my vineyard that I had not done?" Failure to yield good fruits was not due to God's holding back. The people are invited to pass judgment, and the judgment applies to them. In Isaiah, justice meant fair and equitable relationships in a community that has as its base the justice of God. And this justice is expressed through honest dealings with one another. And it fails when a more powerful class of people take advantage of the weaker. It fails when there's a big gap between the rich and the poor. If we are in good relationship with God, then from that relationship will come faithfulness in doing the works that God expects of us, the works of justice in the community. And these should be the characteristics of a people of God, a people under God, and of a nation that claims to be under God. So the prophet suggests that the failure of justice, of peace, will lead to disaster for God's people. This powerful love poem ends with an indictment that the audience, the listeners, need to apply to itself. It stops short of actually pronouncing the judgment, implying there's still time to change, there's still time to conform to God's ways. And as always, you can hear the God of love who raised up a people out of slavery, reminding the people what is expected of them if they are truly to be God's people. There must be a just people, and in their midst, the poor are to be cared for, and justice is to prevail, a sure sign that the nation has a different kind of God who sees to the needs of the poor, the orphaned, and the widowed. We do have our modern Isaiahs, powerful prophetic voices to lead us in God's ways. We need to note, for example, how frequently Pope Francis and the bishops have spoken out against the violence in the world, against things like the arms trade, and how they speak on behalf of the poor, how they speak on for the care of creation. We are called again to read the document of Pope Francis, Laudate Si, and to respond by facing the issues which are challenging the long-term survival of our planet. So all Catholics have special responsibilities to protect human life and dignity, to stand with those who are poor and vulnerable. We are called to welcome the stranger, to combat discrimination, to work for peace, to promote the common good. We can call ourselves God's people when we do this. Isaiah is speaking to us today as well, not just the people of long ago. Isaiah challenges us today. We trace our faith life to its origins in God, who planted the seed of the Christ life within us, to be nourished by the scriptures and sacraments, and gave us prophetic witnesses and parents and teachers. And God has also protected that life within us when it was stressed and tested, and renewed it when we wandered away, and caused it to grow at the most unexpected times. So the first thing we need to do at this Eucharist is to remember with gratitude and thanks our caring God, our nourishing God. But we also have to ask the question that Isaiah asks. After all that God has done for us, what fruits will God find at the time of the harvest? What fruits? And remember, we are the people of God. We are the vineyard of the Lord. And we are there to make sure that there's no discrimination when we gather as church. We need to make sure there's no discrimination against the aged or disabled people or gays or women or the ones without ID books and who are struggling to get work, etc. And so we need to make sure that we are the people of God, that we are bearing fruit. Do we feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the imprisoned? The table of the Eucharist is set before us as a meal for all, for the rich, for the poor, for the powerful and the weak, to eat the same food. And the life of Jesus is given to us today to form us in a community that puts the usual ways of judging aside. And we have to be sure to practice in our lives what we do at this Eucharist. We need to make sure there are no distinctions here in our worshiping community, because when there are no distinctions among us, then there are no distinctions outside. And that is what we are called to do today.